Yes, this is Eduardo Stein from Panama via teleconference.
Body language.
Did you do it 3 times? Okay. Okay. The 8,506th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Mark Lowcock, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Mr. Eduardo Stein, UNHCR IOM Joint Special Representative for Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the region, and Ms. Kathleen Page, researcher at Johns Hopkins University. It is so decided. Mr. Stein is joining via video teleconference from Panama City. I also wish to acknowledge and express our pleasure to have the Secretary General here today, Excellency Mr. António Guterres. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Mark Lowcock.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me be clear from the outset that there is a very real humanitarian problem in Venezuela. The United Nations is willing and able to respond, consistent with the long-standing mandate member states have agreed for principled humanitarian action. We can do more to relieve the suffering of the people of Venezuela if we get more help and support from all stakeholders. Since Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo last briefed you on 26 February, the humanitarian situation has worsened. Recurrent widespread power outages have affected the whole country. Without electricity from the grid, many hospitals have struggled to carry out essential surgical procedures and to sustain intensive care services and dialysis treatment. Water and sewage systems have been interrupted, economic decline has continued, and the purchasing power of ordinary people has fallen further, rendering food even less affordable for many families. The scale of need is significant and growing. The United Nations is working in Venezuela to expand the provision of humanitarian assistance. Our efforts are in line with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, as determined by the General Assembly in Resolutions 46-182 and 58-114. The Secretary-General has expressed his concern for the people in Venezuela. I echo that concern. I'll focus my briefing today on, first, the priority humanitarian needs in Venezuela, second, our efforts to assist the most vulnerable people, and third, the areas where we seek your collective support. Mr. President, we recently produced a draft overview report on priority humanitarian needs in Venezuela. The review was based on the best available data from all available official and unofficial sources, including government data. We gave our draft report to the government and the National Assembly on 27 March. We estimate that 7 million people in Venezuela need humanitarian assistance. That is some 25% of the population. There are people in need throughout the country, but needs are most severe in the 3 states in the south and the Zulia and Lara states in the west. People with chronic health conditions, pregnant and nursing women, children under 5, indigenous people, people on the move, and those living with disabilities are among the most vulnerable. Mr. President, the context is a severe and continuing economic contraction with associated dramatic increases in inflation on a scale seen in few, if any, other countries around the world in recent years. Our review found that access to nutrient-rich foods and a varied diet has diminished. Historically, Venezuela has imported up to 75% of its food. As a result of the crisis, the availability and affordability of food has fallen, with lower imports, reduced local production, and declining purchasing power. Many people depend on subsidized food to meet their needs. 6 million families across the country reportedly benefit from food supplies distributed by the government. Despite this, malnutrition has increased, especially in areas with the highest poverty rates. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization has estimated that in 2018, some 3.7 million people suffered from undernourishment. The prevalence of undernourishment has almost trebled over a 5-year period. Other aid organizations report an increase in the global acute malnutrition rate among children under 5. We estimate that 1.9 million people require nutritional assistance, including 1.3 million children under 5. More data is needed to improve our understanding of the nutrition and food security situation. The Venezuelan health system is strained by shortages in personnel, medical supplies, equipment, and electricity. Reduced access to medicines has increased the risk of morbidity and mortality from diabetes, hypertension, cancer, and HIV/AIDS. Preventable diseases like tuberculosis, diphtheria, measles, and malaria have resurfaced. The World Health Organization registered more than 400,000 cases of malaria in 2017, nearly 70% more than the year before. That was the largest increase in the world that year. Overall, we estimate some 2.8 million people need health assistance, including 1.1 million children under 5. Health problems are exacerbated by insufficient access to clean water and inadequate sanitation systems. One estimate suggests that 17% of people living in poverty have no access to safe water or receive it only once a fortnight. Recent power outages are making this problem worse. Some families have resorted to using water from unclean sources because they cannot afford safe water. Sanitation systems have deteriorated, affecting solid waste management, among other services. Basic hygiene needs, like hand washing, are undermined by the unavailability or unaffordability of water and cleaning supplies. We estimate that some 4.3 million people require water and sanitation assistance. The crisis has interrupted the education of more than 1 million children. Many families cannot afford the transportation, clothing, or shoes children need to go to school. The population on the move is at particular risk of protection violations, as are women and girls, who compose 72% of trafficking victims. More than 3.4 million people have already left the country. We estimate that some 2.7 million people still inside Venezuela require protection, assistance, and services. Mr. President, let me now move on to how we are assisting the most vulnerable people. The United Nations and other humanitarian organizations are on the ground, and we have been expanding our operations. Since 2017, the number of UN staff has increased from 210 to nearly 400. UN agencies are working in all 24 states. Our efforts are particularly concentrated in the vulnerable border states of Zulia, Táchira, and Bolivar. To support the expansion of humanitarian assistance, I released $9 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund in late 2018. Through this grant, as well as bilateral funding from donors, the UN has provided 189,000 children with preventive and curative treatment for acute malnutrition, expanded maternal and child health through the provision of medicines and supplies from 74,000 health kits, donated 10 generators to provide emergency power to hospitals, installed water tanks in hospitals to ensure a safe supply of water for pediatric and maternal services, distributed 10 million tablets for the treatment of HIV among 50,000 people across all 24 states, and delivered 176,000 doses of vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella for babies and young children. The UN and other aid organizations are working with institutions and organizations across the spectrum, including line ministries and national civil society organizations, and we are in touch with the National Assembly. Under the leadership of the UN's resident coordinator, we recently established a cooperation and assistance coordination team, bringing together UN agencies, the Red Cross, and NGOs in Caracas to provide strategic level guidance and coordination to the humanitarian operation. Mr. President, it is clear that much more is needed. We seek the support of this Council for action in 3 areas. First, improved respect for principled humanitarian action. In Venezuela, there is a need to separate political and humanitarian objectives. Humanitarian assistance must be delivered on the basis of need alone. The Secretary-General has repeatedly stressed the importance of the humanitarian principles and has called on Member States and others to respect them. We seek the Council's support to safeguard the neutral and impartial nature of humanitarian action. Second, an enabling operating environment, including sustained and regular access to people in need. I note recent steps taken by the government of Venezuela to facilitate the entrance of additional UN staff into the country and the expansion of humanitarian programs, including those of the Red Cross movement. Additional steps are needed. We need more humanitarian organizations with the capacity to meet urgent needs, to establish a presence and assist with operations in the country. We also need more data and information to ensure our understanding of needs evolves with the situation. Third, more money to support the expansion of humanitarian programs. The resources available now are extremely modest in relation to the needs we see. I would like to thank Member States who've contributed to the provision of humanitarian assistance in Venezuela, including our generous donors supporting the SURF. Your continued support is critical, but we need a lot more. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Lowcock for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Eduardo Stein.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the situation in Venezuela has resulted in a population outflow, the magnitude of which is unparalleled in the modern history of the region. At present, with the last figures at hand, we estimate 3.7 million Venezuelans outside of their country, approximately 80% of which have left since 2015. Although the vast majority of Venezuelans who have left home can be found in neighboring countries and other parts of South America, it is important to note that more than 20 countries are affected by these outflows across the hemisphere and beyond. Last year, Venezuelans left the country at a net rate of about 5,000 per day, and they continue to leave the country despite recent border closures on the Venezuelan side. If the trend continues in 2019, we estimate that the total number of Venezuelans outside the country will exceed 5 million by the end of this year. The testimonials and feedback from Venezuelans arriving to countries in the region outline a range of factors, often in parallel, contributing to their departure from the country. The stated reasons for leaving include insecurity and violence, lack of access to food, medicine, and essential services, as well as loss of income and lack of effective national protection systems. Against this backdrop of deteriorating conditions inside Venezuela, we observe individuals and families leaving the country with increasing needs and vulnerabilities. A disproportionately high rate of family separation is already taking place as some family members leave in search of opportunities to support those back home or secure the means to later bring their relatives. The aforementioned border closures also make it necessary for the majority of persons to cross the border irregularly and in very dangerous conditions, leaving them at additional risks of exploitation and abuse, including through human smuggling and trafficking. The presence of illegal armed actors in multiple border areas and the seasonal rise of border river flows create additional challenges and risks for the continuous population outflows, which includes the possible recruitment also affecting children and youth. In this context, it is important to highlight the generosity of countries receiving Venezuelans for those in transit as well as those being hosted. These countries have largely maintained open-door policies, and through the Quito process, they continue to work towards harmonized approaches on important matters such as reception arrangements, regular stay provisions, documentation, and social, economic, and cultural inclusion. The third Quito meeting on the human mobility of Venezuelans in Latin America brought together this week participants from 12 countries and observers from 13 countries, as well as United Nations agencies, international cooperation agencies, and financial organizations. Technical discussions during the meeting indicated important advances in the harmonization of approaches in the fields of entry, stay requirements, access to rights, and documentation. Participating countries reaffirmed their commitment to the continuity of the Quito process and announced that Argentina will assume the leading role in moving forward the process and host the next meeting in Buenos Aires this July. Paraguay offered to take over the process after Argentina. A priority issue identified by all participants was the urgent need for greater international cooperation and involve multilateral development and financial actors in this unprecedented humanitarian situation affecting many states of the Latin American and Caribbean region, as well as other countries. Despite these efforts, national capacities are increasingly strained, in some cases with the risk of denial of entry or access to regular migration schemes. The experience to date, however, demonstrates that Venezuelans continue to move across the region regularly or irregularly, and it is in the best interests of receiving countries to avoid situations where Venezuelans remain undocumented, invisible, and without access to basic rights, and exposed to situations of violence, exploitation, or abuse. Taking into account these considerations, I would like to highlight some implications for and requests to the Council and the international community as a whole. First, more support is needed for states employing open doors policies to receive, assist, and host Venezuelan outflows, including the initiatives of the Quito process. Second, communities receiving Venezuelans are in need of support. Many of the communities receiving Venezuelans have needs of their own, and support is needed also for the host population. By addressing the needs of both, we can increase the impact of the humanitarian response, mitigate the possibilities of xenophobic expressions, and create a better climate for the local integration of Venezuelans to the host communities. And third, additional support from the international cooperation is critically needed. Despite some important contributions to date, on the whole, more is needed in terms of financial support to countries and other actors engaged in the humanitarian response. These contributions not only strengthen the humanitarian response and socio-economic integration solutions, Mr. President, but also contribute to the stability as a whole as it faces unprecedented humanitarian challenges. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Stein for his briefing and now give the floor to Ms. Kathleen Page.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of the Security Council for the opportunity to present our findings here today. I am Kathleen Page, a physician and faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. The findings that I'm presenting today were published last week by Human Rights Watch with the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our report concludes that the combination of severe medicine, health supplies, food shortages in Venezuela, together with the spread of epidemics within and across the country's borders, has resulted in a breakdown of Venezuela's health system. The crisis in Venezuela fits the definition of a complex humanitarian emergency, and the UN Secretary General, António Guterres, should formally declare it as such and lead a full-scale UN-led response that is neutral, independent, and impartial. We conducted research at the borders of Venezuela in Colombia and Brazil, interviewing more than 150 health professionals, humanitarian actors, UN officials, and local authorities, as well as dozens of Venezuelans who had crossed the border. We also reviewed data from the Venezuelan government, international organizations, Venezuelan hospitals, and other local actors. The health data we analyzed show a health system that is not functioning, with increasing mortality and morbidity. The recent nationwide blackouts have further undermined the ability of public hospitals to respond to the medical needs of Venezuelans. The latest statistics from the Venezuelan Ministry of Health indicate that between 2015 and 2016, maternal mortality rose by 65% and infant mortality by 30%. Venezuela is the only country in the region where infant mortality is rising and has returned to levels last seen in the 1990s. Infectious diseases are increasing and spreading at an alarming rate. Between 2008 and 2016, only a single case of measles was recorded. Since 2017, there were more than 9,300 cases in Venezuela and an additional 10,000 in Brazil, mostly in border areas. Since 2016, there have been more than 2,500 suspected cases of diphtheria, whereas there were none in the preceding decade. Malaria has also increased in recent years, with fewer than 36,000 cases in 2009 to more than 414,000 cases in 2017, the highest rate of increase in the world. The number of tuberculosis cases increased from 6,000 in 2014 to 13,000 in 2017, resulting in the highest TB incidence rate in 40 years. In 2018, nearly 9 of 10 Venezuelans living with HIV were not receiving antiretroviral therapy. Although Venezuelan authorities stopped publishing statistics on nutrition in 2007, available evidence indicates that hunger, malnutrition, and severe food shortages are widespread. Between 2015 and 17, nearly 12% of Venezuelans, 3.7 million people, were undernourished. National surveys show that 80% of Venezuelan households are food insecure. In some locations, acute malnutrition among children surpasses crisis thresholds. Hospitals across the country are reporting increases in pediatric admissions and mortality due to acute malnutrition. Venezuelan authorities no longer publish official health information. They have threatened and retaliated against healthcare workers who collect data, report deaths, or speak out about medicine shortages. Objective and verifiable data are critical to assess the situation, follow trends, and create an effective humanitarian response. While more international aid has started to enter the country, the response to date has been insufficient, and there have been obstacles to implementation. While Venezuelan authorities are within their rights to reject particular offers of assistance, they are responsible for fully addressing the country's urgent humanitarian needs. To protect the rights to health and food of the Venezuelan people, we recommend that the Secretary General declare that Venezuela is facing a complex humanitarian emergency and acknowledge the severity of the situation. The crisis should be a top priority that requires a UN system-wide, full-scale mobilization of humanitarian relief. The Secretary General should request that Venezuelan authorities grant full access to UN agencies to data about health, nutrition, and food security, and allow them to undertake a nationwide, comprehensive humanitarian needs assessment. The response we are calling for would be credible, neutral, and independent, as well as impartial, as it would be under the auspices of the United Nations. Furthermore, the UN Security Council should regularly meet to address a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, as well as its regional impact, where more than 3.4 million Venezuelans have left the country in recent years. We call upon the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to document violations to the rights to health and food in her upcoming report on the situation of Venezuela. And finally, we call upon the UN Human Rights Council to continue to monitor the humanitarian situation in Venezuela and adopt a resolution to create an international commission of inquiry to investigate violations of the rights to health and food. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
I thank Ms. Page for her briefing. I will give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements, and we will start with His Excellency Mr. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States of America, who is about to arrive. While we are waiting for the Vice President, let me already say that first thanking the briefers and also then asking them to stay, also Mr. Stein, so that we can ask questions to them around the council, and then in a final round you could also then respond to those questions that have been made. We are just bear with me for a second. I welcome and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mike Pence, Vice President of the United States of America. You have the floor.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, to all the members of the Security Council, I am here today on behalf of the President of the United States of America to discuss the ongoing crisis in Venezuela and to call on this body to stand up for democracy and the rule of law in that nation that has suffered so much. Article 24 of the UN Charter confers on this Security Council the responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. As another American president said many years ago, the United Nations is designed to make possible lasting freedom and independence for all its members. It is why this institution exists. For 6 long years, the people of Venezuela have suffered under the heavy hand of oppression. The Maduro regime's socialist policies have shrunk their economy by nearly half. In what was once one of the wealthiest countries in our hemisphere, 9 out of 10 people now live in poverty. The average Venezuelan has lost more than 20 pounds through deprivation and malnutrition. Thousands of Venezuelan children are starving. And at this very hour, infants in hospitals across Venezuela are dying for lack of basic medical care. And the Maduro regime, in the midst of this deprivation and suffering, has used violence and intimidation against anyone who opposes their actions. In the last 3 months, the regime has thrown at least 1,255 people into jail without any due process of law and killed at least 40 protesters. That's the nature of the regime that we're dealing with. But the Maduro regime is not only a threat to the Venezuelan people, it is a threat to the peace and security of the wider region as well. The rising desperation in Venezuela has fueled a mass exodus, the likes of which we have never seen in the Western Hemisphere. More than 3 million Venezuelans have now abandoned their beloved country, and if things don't get better, it is estimated that another 2 million are expected to follow before the year is out. Traveling through the region, my wife and I witnessed the results of this deprivation firsthand. At a church in Manaus, Brazil, we spoke to families who had fled the deprivation in Venezuela. And I'll never forget when a father looked at me with his 2 young boys standing at his side and said how hard it was as a father to come home at the end of the day and say, "We're not eating today." And as he said it, his 2 little boys looked up and nodded, recalling those days. And then there was the day in Cartagena, Colombia, at another mission where Venezuelan people had fled the deprivation in their country, and a grandmother told me how it had gotten so bad in their small rural town, her grandchildren had had to rise at 4 a.m. to get a single ticket to purchase a piece of bread at 4 p.m. Their children were starving. And she gathered up her grandchildren and fled the country. Those are the stories the world deserves to hear of deprivation. The truth is, those who stay behind are subject to crime, violence, and lawlessness. Thieves in Venezuela don't rob banks, they rob restaurants for food. Vicious gangs and so-called colectivos have turned the streets into war zones. Venezuela now has the highest murder rate in the world, as more than 70 people are murdered every single day. Venezuela is a failed state. And as history teaches, failed states know no boundaries. Drug traffickers, criminal gangs, even terrorists like Hezbollah are exploiting the chaos in Venezuela to gain a foothold in the region and export crime and violence. Were we to let the crisis continue, the chaos and suffering will only spread. The struggle in Venezuela is between dictatorship and democracy. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power, and Nicolas Maduro must go. But for all the suffering, the Venezuelan people, across Venezuela in Cities large and small, people are rising up. They're rising up against their oppression and deprivation. Today, those courageous Venezuelans will take to the streets again. And as President Trump said not long ago, the fight for freedom in Venezuela has just begun. Just 3 short months ago, after Nicolas Maduro was sworn into his second term, stolen in a sham election, the National Assembly, the only duly elected body in Venezuela, exercised its power under the Constitution and recognized a new leader, interim President Juan Guaido. And all across the Western Hemisphere, nations have been standing up to declare their support for President Guaido. Last month, the Inter-American Development Bank voted to seat President Guaido's representative. Earlier this week, the G7 issued a statement saying the May 2018 presidential election lacked legitimacy and called on the Maduro regime to, in their words, restore the authority of the National Assembly. And just yesterday, the Organization of American States, the oldest regional organization in the world, voted to stand with the Venezuelan people and recognize the Guaido government's representative as the only true representative of Venezuela. At President Trump's direction, the United States was proud to be the first nation to recognize interim President Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And today, 54 nations have joined us. The Western Hemisphere has spoken with a clear voice. Nations across the world have spoken. It's time for the United Nations to speak. In February, the United States introduced a resolution to the Security Council that called for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela and for the Maduro regime to allow all humanitarian aid to enter the country. The resolution was not approved. 2 nations which continue to back this brutal regime used their vetoes to stop this body from taking action. And while Russia and China continue to obstruct the Security Council, rogue states like Iran and Cuba are doing all they can to prop up the Maduro regime. For decades, Cuba has tried to create client states across our region. While normal countries export goods, Cuba exports tyranny and strong-arm tactics. Even now, Cuban military and intelligence services train and support and equip Venezuela's secret police as they silence opponents, jail and torture members of the opposition. Last week, the United States took action to sanction ships transporting Venezuelan oil to Cuba. And soon, at President Trump's direction, the United States will announce additional action to hold Cuba accountable for its malign influence in Venezuela. And this week, in addition to Cuba's action, Caracas received a delegation from Iran to begin direct air service between these 2 rogue capitals. This blacklisted airline is used to export terrorism by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which President Trump formally designated as a foreign terrorist organization on Monday. This is the company that Nicolas Maduro keeps. And these nations continue to prop him up even as he inflicts suffering on the Venezuelan people. Just 2 months ago, the dictator in Caracas actually danced while his own citizens were shot and truckloads of desperately needed food and medicine burned. Unlike nations that are subsidizing the dictator in Caracas, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, the United States has been standing with the people of Venezuela. And we are committed to helping the families and communities that have been devastated by the Maduro regime. At this point, the United States has sanctioned more than 150 government officials and organizations loyal to the dictator, We've sanctioned state-owned businesses to prevent the Maduro regime from robbing the people of what is rightfully theirs. And as President Trump has said, we can be a lot tougher. In addition, the United States has positioned more than 500 metric tons of food and humanitarian supplies on the Venezuelan border, ready for immediate distribution. We've provided $200 million in aid to support displaced Venezuelans and the host communities that support them. And today, at President Trump's direction, the United States is announcing an additional $60 million in humanitarian assistance to address this crisis. The United States of America will continue to exert all diplomatic and economic pressure to bring about a peaceful transition to democracy in Venezuela, but all options are on the table. Up to this point, while other international bodies have acted, the United Nations and this Security Council have refused to act. But now that nations across this hemisphere have spoken, the time has come for the United Nations to recognize interim President Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela and seat his representative in this body. This body should revoke the credentials of Venezuela's representative to the United Nations, recognize interim President Juan Guaido, and seat the representative of the Free Venezuelan government in this body without delay. With all due respect, Mr. Ambassador, you shouldn't be here. You should return to Venezuela and tell Nicolas Maduro that his time is up. It's time for him to go. Members of this Security Council, the men, women, and children of Venezuela are suffering. Their economy has been destroyed. Their democracy has been destroyed. The people of Venezuela are paying the price. And soon the region and the world will pay the price if we fail to act. There can be no bystanders to this history. For the peace and security of our hemisphere, the world and the United Nations must stand with the people of Venezuela. To that end, the United States is preparing a resolution recognizing the legitimacy of the government of interim President Juan Guaido. And today we urge every member of the Security Council and all UN member states to support this resolution. Stand with the Venezuelan people as they rise up to restore freedom, democracy, and libertad to their nation. And this they are doing. They are rising up against intimidation and violence. Even today, the people of Venezuela are taking to the streets to march for freedom. Despite all the hardship, they continue to march. Despite all of the oppression, they continue to march. Despite the opposition, they continue to march with courage and strength because they're marching to freedom. And in the words of Simón Bolívar, a people that loves freedom will in the end be free. But now is time for the United Nations to act and for the world to stand with the people of Venezuela as they march to freedom. History has taught us what happens when the civilized nations of the world allow oppression to go unchecked. When a brutal dictatorship arose in Europe, the world failed to respond. Millions of lives were lost in the Second World War. This very institution was forged in the aftermath of that war, so that nations around the world could come together and confront dictatorship with one voice. And so the United States is calling on the United Nations to live up to its very purpose. Reject the failed leadership of Nicolas Maduro. Stand with us, stand with nations across the world, across this hemisphere, to help the people of Venezuela forge a brighter future. As President Trump has said, quote, "If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph." When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. So let us today rededicate ourselves to the mission upon which this body was founded, to maintain international peace and security. And we have confidence that if we do that, if we make every effort to be at peace, that the God of peace will guide us and bless us today, tomorrow, and always. So thank you, Mr. President, for the honor of addressing you today. May God bless the people of Venezuela. May God bless you all.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Pence for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russia. Vasily, you have the floor, and I turn on also again for us the hourglass.
Thank you, Mr. President. You can turn your hourglass on and move it as many times as you wish, but I will take as much time as I need to, Mr. President. We are surprised and at the same time not surprised by having the Security Council convene an emergency session with the participation of the Vice President of the United States, which of course we're always happy to see him in this room. It's just unfortunately that he didn't want to listen to the other members of the Council about what they think about the situation in Venezuela. Today, we are witnessing yet another episode of a tragedy with several acts in the attempt to change regime in Venezuela. The situation in Venezuela does not represent a threat to international peace and security. However, the external players are a direct threat to the peace and security of Venezuela itself. And we just heard that today. Today, we've just heard a horrific description of the suffering of the Venezuelan people under the yoke of an illegitimate dictator. And the only way to ease those sufferings is through decisive action by the international community, obviously led by the United States. Well, I'd like to ask, where did you get these figures and testimonies that we heard about today? When was the last time anyone who spoke today actually visited Venezuela? It turns out that you're examining the situation from a distance based on the premise that President Guaido is the only legitimate authority in the country and a source of information about what is taking place there. And by the way, I want to say to Madam Page, who told us about a very difficult situation with healthcare in Venezuela. And in particular, she spoke of the measles epidemic. I have to say that unfortunately this epidemic is taking place. Madam Page, do you know that the authorities of New York have declared an emergency situation due to a measles epidemic that has been occurring in New York, a few hundred meters from this building in Brooklyn? We have already seen all this in other regions in the world from so-called witnesses who have settled in the West, and they told of blood-curdling stories about the sufferings of the nations of Iraq, Libya, and Syria. And it was precisely as a result of Western intervention in those countries that the true suffering began there, and that continues to this day. Do you want to see the same thing in Venezuela? Just as the legitimate authorities in Caracas, we do not deny that the humanitarian situation in this country is far from ideal. We're ready to work with them to improve this situation. We are guided in this by the provisions of General Assembly Resolution 46/182, which envisions inter alia the requirement of a request by the legitimate authority for providing to that government humanitarian assistance. And the Secretary of the UN should contribute to that. However, the report of OCHA has led to a dual impression in our minds. On the one hand, it stresses the need of separating the political and humanitarian tasks in providing assistance to Venezuela. Of course, we are in favor of a neutral and impartial character of humanitarian assistance. However, on the other hand, we're disappointed that the information that has been collected and published today has not received was done without the endorsement of the government of Venezuela. So it turns out that we're returning to the not very glorious past when OCHA used unverified information in publishing its reports. We would like to hope that that is not the case. Furthermore, a preparation of needs assessment is a part and parcel of preparation of a humanitarian plan of assistance, which in turn can only be done with the agreement of the legitimate authorities. Not complying with this principle undermines a key aspect of Resolution 46/182. Mr. President, we categorically reject the methods of the United States with regard to Venezuela. With the one hand, you're grabbing Venezuela by the throat by introducing still new sanctions and restrictions which prevent the country from developing normally. At the same time, international assistance that is required by states should be aimed at creating a situation where a state can take care of its own citizens. However, with the other hand, you are also picking the pockets of Venezuelans. You're shamelessly expropriating Venezuelan assets in Western banks. Just from the beginning of this year, you have taken some $30 billion from the country, claiming that only the self-proclaimed President Guaidó can use those funds. The overall damage from the actions of the United States to the Venezuelan economy since 2013 can be calculated in hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, you call on urgent assistance to the Venezuelan people. And I'd like to just recall that in the United States, not everything is very smooth with humanitarian assistance per se. You still haven't overcome the consequences of the devastating Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico in the fall of 2017. At the time, there were serious problems with the lack of water, food, electricity, and medical assistance. Some 225,000 people were homeless. The whole harvest of vital crops was lost. The overall damage at the time, according to various estimates, was from 45 to 90 billion US dollars. At the time, Washington completely rejected international assistance. In September of 2017, President Maduro stated the readiness of Venezuela to immediately launch a program of support and solidarity to Puerto Rico to overcome the consequences of Maria in Puerto Rico. Was also there were proposals from Cuba. This was also rejected by Washington. As a result, Venezuela did provide assistance to Puerto Rico through Citgo, a subsidiary of PDVSA in the United States, while the Cuban government respected the rejection of the American people's refusal, did not insist, and did not use this for propaganda purposes, even though many were unhappy with this decision in the United States. Caracas is not rejecting humanitarian assistance that is provided based on the principles approved by the United Nations. Russia and other countries have provided such assistance in the framework of the WHO. Now, What's preventing the end of the crisis in Venezuela are the sanctions and external interference in the internal affairs of the state. As for internal political differences, we're convinced that only a dialogue within Venezuela itself can overcome those differences. The United States has insistently destabilized the situation in Venezuela. They have artificially provoked a crisis in this country in order to overthrow a legitimately elected leader and replace him with their own pawn. Examples of the blatant interference of the United States in the affairs of Latin America and the overthrow with the use of military force of leaders that they didn't like. There are many, many such examples. I would like to once again address the neighbors of Venezuela. Haven't you learned anything from history? Don't you understand that Venezuela is merely a bargaining chip in the geopolitical and geostrategic struggle for influence in the region and the world? Very much in the spirit of a revitalized Monroe Doctrine. And by the way, the attitude of the Latin American countries to what is taking place in Venezuela are not as uniform and unequivocal as we've heard today from the Vice President. It's very strange to once again discuss what should be self-evident truths. That is, the solving the provoked crisis in Venezuela can only be through internal Venezuelan dialogue. And the self-proclaimed president is not ready to this because he didn't get instructions to that effect. But there is no other way forward. In this context, we welcome international initiatives of helping to foster dialogue between the legitimate government and leaders of the opposition. Such initiatives have come from the Latin American region, and in particular, the proposal from Mexico and Uruguay as part of the Montevideo mechanism is very promising. It provides for a comprehensive and all-inclusive dialogue, and from this point of view, it has much more chance of success than those initiatives that demand preliminary conditions to even be launched. The possibility of joining the good offices or mediation efforts should be open to everyone who are trying to make a constructive contribution to establishing an inclusive dialogue within Venezuela. And what is taking place in the Security Council today, unfortunately, is merely another episode of a frontal attack against the government in Caracas and ordinary Venezuelans. I'd like to recall that in parallel with the attempts to impose humanitarian assistance, the so-called well-wishers are actively trying to challenge the credentials of the official Venezuelan delegation at various international platforms. We heard this today from the Vice President. I'm not going to comment the tone of his statement, but I want to say to that the permanent representative of Venezuela in this room was appointed by the legitimate government of this country, and it was confirmed by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Furthermore, these friends of Venezuela are so-called friends, are replacing the official ambassadors of Venezuela, the seizure of diplomatic property. And this way, what we're seeing is a blatant violation of the founding principles of the UN, the violation of the norms of international law. Perhaps to actively, perhaps the international rule-based order that is so actively promoted by Western colleagues, provides for such a lawless, thuggish violation of international law. But international law does not. We call on the United States to once again recognize that the Venezuelan people and other peoples have the right to determine their own future. If you want to make America great again, and we're all sincerely interested in seeing that, and stop interfering in the affairs of other states. You will only gain respect from that. You don't like when others interfere in your affairs. No one likes that. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russia, and I now give the floor to the representative of Peru. Gustavo, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we'd like to thank the distinguished briefers for the very valuable information provided at today's informative briefing. This helps us once again to raise the alarm with regard to the serious humanitarian crisis, the collapse of the economy, and of the public services unprecedented in Latin America. This is the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. In this regard, I would like to highlight that the content of this statement is shared by Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, and Paraguay, country members of the Lima Group. Just a few figures with regard to the Venezuelan economy in order to better understand the situation, such as the estimates of the International Monetary Fund, which establishes an inflation rate of 1.5 million% for 2018 alone, a drop in the GDP of 44% since 2013, or the Living Conditions Survey of 2018 in CAVI. This is a joint project of the Central, Andrés Bello Catholic, and Simón Bolívar universities of Venezuela, which states that this brotherly country, which had one of the highest incomes in the region, now keeps 94% of its citizens in a situation of poverty, 60% of them in extreme poverty, with 80% of them at risk of food insecurity, because they don't have sufficient income to buy food. Thus, whilst the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro hides these figures that show that the economy of Venezuela is in freefall and boasts that Venezuela does not need humanitarian aid, the hospitals are collapsing without vaccines or medicines. We're seeing a resurgence of diseases that have been eradicated. An increase in unemployment, sharp increase. Cities are becoming more violent. Electricity and water provision are collapsing, and the brain drain is offering an even darker future of great concern. All of this is the responsibility of a regimen that has been declared illegitimate by the Organization of American States through a resolution of its Permanent Council. An authoritative regime which silences the media, which represses and imprisons the opposition, and which abuses its absolute power. In this context, migration currently stands at 3.5 million people, with 5,000 new emigrants on a daily basis, which presupposes an enormous challenge for the host countries in terms of providing healthcare, education, housing, employment, and integration. We should point out that countries of the region have earmarked significant domestic contingency resources to provide these social services to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans that we have hosted. In some cases, this is going beyond our capacity. How did we arrive at this situation? The answer is clear. This crisis, unprecedented in history, is due to the illegitimate nature and oppressive nature of a regime which has added to the breakdown of constitutional order and the rule of law its incompetence in managing the economy, corruption, and the diversion of resources, illicit diversion of resources, turning a prosperous and mighty country such as Venezuela into one that harbors poverty, insecurity, and despair. There is now a pressing need to provide humanitarian assistance to alleviate the suffering of millions of Venezuelans, and clearly the situation cannot be controlled by or entrusted to an illegitimate regime which uses aid solely for the purposes of politics and propaganda. In the short term, it's urgent that we channel humanitarian assistance through the United Nations system and the International Red Cross, possibly with the support and participation of local and international NGOs on the ground. This will make it possible to be impartial and independent and ensure that the assistance reaches those that most need it. This urgent and necessary response should not lead us to forget, however, that it's only a palliative to the genuine solution to the problem in Venezuela, the impact of which in the region is threatening peace and security. This solution involves the restoration of democracy and the rule of law in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, led by the Venezuelans themselves in a peaceful manner in the framework of the Constitution and international law, supported by politicians and diplomats and without the use of force. We reaffirm, therefore, our recognition of the support for the National Assembly, the interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, and his representatives taking up this mandate. We call upon the international community and the members of this council to accompany the countries of the Lima Group in our efforts to attempt to re-establish constitutional order in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in order to address the deep-seated causes that have led to the serious humanitarian situation about which we're meeting today. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Peru, and I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic. Jose, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we would like to thank you for having facilitated this meeting. It's important that this Council take up again the situation in Venezuela in light of recent events. In particular, we deplore the fact and we are concerned at the worsening of the conditions in the country, which has worsened the humanitarian crisis affecting millions of Venezuelans and which continues to drive many of them to leave their country in search of better possibilities for subsistence. According to the FAO, 11.7% of the population of Venezuela is undernourished. Also, in recent years, there's been a dramatic increase in the proportion of people living in poverty. Every day, millions of Venezuelans face unprecedented challenges in order to access basic services such as health, medicines, vaccines, water, electricity, and education. Diseases such as tuberculosis, diphtheria, measles, and malaria have surged throughout the country. In recent weeks, the situation has become even more complicated due to power outages throughout virtually all of the country, which have gone on for several days. The results have been disastrous. We've seen tragic situations in hospitals where the lack of electricity has forced medical staff very often to work without the minimum conditions for hygiene and equipment. The lack of water is another dramatic consequence of these blackouts. In the same way, in very many places, there has been a temporary suspension of classes and work activities, which is having an impact on the country's productivity and contributing to its worsening economic situation. And against this backdrop, there is no sign of a significant improvement in the situation in the short term. Mr. President, the crisis in Venezuela cannot be solved solely through humanitarian assistance. It is urgent that we find the conditions to carry out practical negotiation which will lead to a solution to the crisis through a fair, free and competitive electoral process with guarantees for all groups and political actors, with the support of the international community and in a climate of respect for human rights. We also must insist that this should be a solution that is led by the Venezuelans themselves and achieved in a peaceful manner. We reiterate our firm willingness to work together with the international community in order to help Venezuela find answers to this crisis, democratic answers in line with the rule of law, internally as well as internationally, and which, above all, will open the door for the rebuilding of Venezuelan society in a spirit of cohesion and a vision for the future. Mr. President, aware as we are of the central role that states play in humanitarian action, and with a view to bringing about a substantive increase in humanitarian assistance for the country, we would urgently call upon the Venezuelan authorities to recognize the serious economic situation in which the country finds itself. In this regard, we would encourage them to establish spaces for coordination and for humanitarian action with actors on the ground, supported by the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, to ensure that the aid reaches the populations that most need it and that are most vulnerable. We recognize the work that has been done in the framework of the Coordination Team for Cooperation and Assistance, ECA, in order to alleviate existing needs, and we call upon all players, including government authorities, to continue working on humanitarian action that is people-focused. All actions should address the priority needs of Venezuelans with an approach that will make it possible to lay the basis for steering the country back to sustainable development and make it possible to see the return of 3.4 million Venezuelans who were forced to leave their country. We believe that the recent agreement achieved by the International Federation of the Red Cross to broaden its humanitarian action in the country is an encouraging step, despite the fact that the 650,000 people awaiting aid are only a fraction of the total number that require immediate assistance. We are sure that this will only be the first step on the path towards the opening up of new initiatives and measures which will have a positive impact on the life of Venezuelans. We would also like to stress the need to make the mechanisms for entry into the country of authorized personnel more agile and that they have unlimited access to the areas that are most vulnerable. We support the broadening of the United Nations presence on the ground and call upon the international community to ensure that the necessary financial resources are available to provide the humanitarian assistance that Venezuela so sorely needs. In conclusion, we would call upon the members of this council to maintain their focus on improving the humanitarian situation in Venezuela, to promote the principles in the Charter and international humanitarian law, and to strengthen the role of the United Nations in the process of negotiation for a solution to this very serious crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank the Ambassador of the Dominican Republic for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of China. Xiaozhu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. China has been following the developments in Venezuela closely. China supports the Venezuelan government in its efforts to uphold its national sovereignty, independence, and stability, and holds that the Venezuelan affairs should be handled independently by the Venezuelan people themselves. China calls upon the Venezuelan government and opposition parties to seek a political solution through dialogue and consultation within the constitutional and legal framework. Mr. President, China's position on the Security Council's involvement in the Venezuelan issue has been consistently clear. Our point of departure is, as always, to uphold the spirit of the UN Charter and the basic norms governing international relations, promote a peaceful settlement of the Venezuelan issue, and maintain long-term peace and development in Latin America. China opposes external forces interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs, opposes military intervention in Venezuela, and opposes using the so-called humanitarian issue to achieve political aims. History has proven repeatedly that unilateral sanction will only further complicate situations and affect people's everyday life. It won't help resolve problems, nor will it bring peace to a country. On the one hand, we hear tall talks to care about well-being of the Venezuelans, and on the other hand, we are seeing increasingly tighter sanctions on the country. They don't seem to reconcile well. The motive is dubious. To help its people overcome temporary difficulties, China has decided to provide emergency aid of civilian goods to Venezuela. The relevant supplies are on their way to Venezuela in batches. On March 29th, the first batch of medicines and medical supplies were delivered to the Venezuelan government. China's assistance to Venezuela is in keeping with its long-held principles for foreign aid. It is intended to help Venezuelan people overcome negative impacts caused by external interferences and sanctions with no political conditions attached. China will continue its cooperation with Venezuela based on the principles of mutual respect, equality, mutual benefits, and common development for the greater well-being of the two peoples. Mr. President, the peace and stability of Venezuela is in fundamental interests of the country and its people. It also serves the common interests of all parties. We hope that the international community will do things that are truly conducive to the stability, economic development, and a better livelihood in Venezuela, and will, under the premise of respecting the sovereignty of Venezuela, provide constructive assistance to the country and promote a smooth settlement of relevant issues as soon as possible. We hope that relevant countries will promptly lift unilateral sanctions on Venezuela, create normal conditions for its economic and social development, and lend help and support to the country in accordance with the basic principles of the UN humanitarian assistance.
Earlier in his intervention, the U.S. representative leveled unfounded accusations against China's position on this agenda item, which China categorically rejects. As is common knowledge, China has all along maintained friendly and cooperative relations with other countries around the world, Venezuela included, on the basis of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. We support the people of various countries in independently choosing a development path that caters to their national realities. We never interfere in other countries' internal affairs, nor do we impose on other countries. Member states of the Security Council should faithfully abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the universally recognized norms of international relations, and genuinely respect the choice of other countries' peoples to do more practical and conducive things for the people of Venezuela rather than the opposite. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Chinese ambassador for his statement, and je donne la parole au...
I give the floor to the representative of France, Francois. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, my dear Christophe. Allow me to start by hailing, in particular, the participation in this meeting, the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Vice President of the United States. The speakers who I'd like to thank have painted a picture that is absolutely clear. Venezuela has been plunged into the worst humanitarian crisis in its history, with consequences that have been felt throughout the American consequences. And unlike what we are going to hear, there is no so-called foreign plot behind this chaos. The Venezuelan regime is the sole and only culprit of this tragic situation, which has further deteriorated due to the large-scale breakdown of the electric supply system, followed by cutoff in water supplies. The Venezuelan people, unfortunately, haven't seen the worst of it. The increase of all indicators measuring poverty, violence, mortality might only be a prelude to an even deeper crisis unless something is done to ease the suffering of the Venezuelan people and move towards a political and peaceful solution to the situation. That is the issue which should bring us together. This is the following question. How can we reverse the tragic dynamic that has been that we've been witnessing? I will focus on three urgent matters. The first urgent matter is to ensure and facilitate access by humanitarian agencies and non-governmental organizations while fully respecting the principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. The outer limits of cruelty seem to constantly be pushed outward when we note that the allies of the regime are ready to divert humanitarian assistance. This kind of use for political purposes of such a situation should be condemned in every case. The position of the Venezuelan regime of denying that there's a humanitarian crisis and restricting access of humanitarian assistance has a cost that can be measured in human lives. I will simply mention the impact on the breakdown of the system of healthcare on the most vulnerable people, and the increase in malnutrition and increase in mortality. Since the position of France has been clear. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the Venezuelan people. France, together with the European Union, has prepared a response that is commensurate to the scale of this crisis. The European Union announced on the 27th of March another 50 million euros of assistance to Venezuela, in addition to the assistance that was already provided. Now, the second urgent matter is to provide assistance to the some 3.5 million Venezuelans who have chosen to take the path of exile due to the chaos and violence. And I welcome the assistance of all the countries of the region. Their solidarity has been exemplary, really. In particular, Colombia, which has shouldered the heaviest burden with some 1.4 million refugees and migrants. And I would like to welcome the presence of the Colombian foreign minister in this room, in this chamber. Such an engagement that has continued really deserves our admiration, even as we observe the continued flow of people leaving the country, some 5,000 people a day, as indicated by the special representative. Unless there's a radical change in the position of the Venezuelan authorities, and unless they fully cooperate with humanitarian agencies, this exodus could further accelerate and have a very negative impact on the stability and development of neighboring countries. And would like to express our solidarity with France with the countries affected. We urge the Venezuelan regime to seize the opportunity created by the International Contact Group, which has been working hard with an active participation of France in trying to find a political and humanitarian solution to the crisis. And lastly, the third urgent matter is to begin a political and peaceful transition in Venezuela in the form of a free, credible, and transparent presidential elections under the observation of the international community. Now, as far as answering the question of the causes of this humanitarian crisis, we will no doubt once again hear the Venezuelan authorities accuse foreigners of being behind the tragedy of Venezuelan people. And yet it is, in fact, the Maduro regime which is both the author and the main actor of this tragedy, by wanting to hold on to power, by organizing a mockery of presidential elections, by persecuting the opposition and dissidents, by appropriating the wealth of Venezuela. The current regime has precipitated has pushed an entire country and entire people to the edge of the abyss. Many countries, including France and its European partners, have drawn the necessary conclusions from this situation. The Speaker of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, has become the interim president, not as a result of foreign support, but as based on the Venezuelan constitution and with a view to organize credible and transparent elections. Mr. President, it is unacceptable that the survival of a regime takes place at the expense of the life of its people. We urge the Venezuelan authorities to allow humanitarian assistance reach the Venezuelan people and to take the path of a peaceful, democratic, and lasting solution. The Security Council will need to demonstrate its unity to play the role that it must in this situation. The goal is to promote a negotiated and peaceful solution to the crisis. What must be avoided is the use of force and violence in Venezuela. France in particular wants to stress this point. There can only be a peaceful and political solution, and such a solution requires the organization as soon as possible of democratic presidential elections. While Venezuela today is at the edge of the abyss, our role is not to serve as a substitute to the Venezuelan people. It's quite to the contrary, to allow the Venezuelan people to speak freely and express its wish to decide on its future, and in particular by reestablishing democracy and the rule of law in Venezuela. That, Mr. President, is the essence and the meaning of French efforts in this crisis. Thank you very much. Thank you, Representative of France, for your statement.
The floor to the United Kingdom. Karen.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you to our three briefers, and thank you to the United States for proposing this discussion today, and to Vice President Pence for joining the Security Council. Mr. President, it's clear from the briefings that we heard that the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has reached epic proportions, and it is right that the Security Council should discuss such issues. I know there's an age-old debate that we've never resolved as to how bad does a situation have to get within a country in order for it to constitute the sort of issue that the Security Council has looked at. But the figures that we've heard today and the effect on the Venezuelan people and the effect on their neighbours and the view of the regional authorities and the view of the international authorities as represented by the Special Envoy and as represented by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, I think make it absolutely an issue that this Council should be discussing. Mr. President, we've heard today how ordinary Venezuelans are unable to access food and basic health care. Preventable diseases such as measles and diphtheria have reappeared. HIV goes untreated, and maternal and newborn mortality rates are extremely high. Electricity and water shortages, as many speakers have said, have made it all much worse. The figures are appalling, but we're also starting to hear words like unprecedented and unparalleled. And I heard today some things I didn't know, particularly about the health side, so thank you to Dr. Page. And it's truly shocking. The malaria figure particularly stuck in my mind. I think the answer on measles is to refer to the George Washington University study about Russian social media. So I'm not going to go into that there, but I think the malaria figure alone ought to really horrify us. I think it's all the more shocking because, as a number of speakers have said, this crisis is man-made, and all the more so because Venezuela used to be a prosperous country. My understanding of the OECD and World Bank figures, Mr. President, is that Venezuela was considered to be an upper middle income country, so that you can go from that status to having the sorts of problems that we heard described today really does draw the concern of the international community. I wanted also to reference the refugee situation. We've heard the figure, 3.4 million Venezuelans have left their country to go to their neighbours. I too welcome the presence of the Colombian Foreign Minister here today, and we commend him and his government and our Security Council colleague Peru and others in the region that have offered refuge and hope to those millions of ordinary Venezuelans. But we can't rely solely on the region's efforts because, as we also heard today, that number is set to rise quite dramatically. I wanted to thank UNHCR and IOM through the Special Envoy for the efforts they have made. And I think we agree it's a positive first step that the Maduro regime no longer denies the existence of the crisis and that the Red Cross and the UN are allowed to start the international humanitarian response. And the scale of what's needed was set out graphically by the Emergency Relief Coordinator. So I think it just points to how much more needs to be done. For the United Kingdom, we agree with the majority of this Council, Mr. President, for a new start in Venezuela, and we will be working closely with the international community to ensure assistance can reach those most in need. But I wanted to echo what Vice President Pence said in his emphasis on democracy and the rule of law. We stand with the Venezuelan people. This is about what is needed to help the Venezuelan people. So we support the UN's efforts under OCHA's leadership to mount an international humanitarian response commensurate with the severity of the situation and underpinned by the principles of independence, neutrality and impartiality. And I would call Member States' attention to the three areas that the Emergency Relief Coordinator outlined. We call on the Maduro regime, Mr. President, and all actors to facilitate the humanitarian process and to allow further international UN, Red Cross and NGO humanitarian organisations unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to meet the urgent needs of the Venezuelan people. I repeat, it is against international law to try and deny your own people the help that they need, particularly food. I'd also like, Mr. President, to use this occasion to call on Member States to support the UN's efforts. For our part, we have committed a package of nearly $9 million in humanitarian aid to respond to the most severe needs in Venezuela and host countries. We hope that our aid package will respond to the most severe health and nutrition needs by supporting emergency rooms and maternity wards. We hope to help people fleeing their homes have access to critical support, and we hope to help meet the immediate needs of those forced to flee Venezuela who are at greater risk of exploitation. So we plan to offer migrants access to personal documentation and information on how to access basic services. Mr. President, it's important we're clear that the suffering faced by the Venezuelan people is a result of years of mismanagement by the de facto government. Humanitarian aid is urgently needed, but as many speakers have spoken out today, it won't solve the crisis. Political change is equally urgent. The legitimate interim president, Juan Guaido, was stripped of his immunity as Speaker of the National Assembly. His chief of staff was arrested, and others who are trying to secure peace and democracy in Venezuela have suffered similar intimidation and threats. Mr. Guaido has our full support in his efforts to bring about the necessary change. The people of Venezuela deserve a better future, and I repeat, Mr. President, it is our belief that it's time for a new start with free and fair elections in accordance with international democratic standards. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her intervention. Et je donne la parole au...
I now give the floor to the representative of Belgium. Mark, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank the briefers for the information they provided. So as to ensure that the situation does not deteriorate any further, we call all members of the Council to work together in order to promote a peaceful outcome to the crisis. We launch an appeal to make sure that violence is avoided at all costs. In this regard, I would like to voice three messages now. First of all, the importance of full humanitarian access in line with humanitarian principles. The second, the need to launch as soon as possible a peaceful political process which will open the way to free and transparent presidential elections. And third message is an appeal to protect the citizens of Venezuela from all forms of violence. So, first of all, it is obvious that the situation in Venezuela is a humanitarian crisis. We have just heard that described by the briefers. About a quarter of Venezuelans need emergency humanitarian assistance. Amongst the hardest hit are those who have chronic health problems, the pregnant women, children, and the indigenous people. And we need to do everything that we can in order to relieve the suffering of these vulnerable groups. We therefore call on all actors to authorize and facilitate a safe, rapid, and unhindered access to humanitarian supplies into the country. We recall the need to abide by the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence in provision of humanitarian assistance. And we underscore that it's important to ensure that this assistance needs to be provided according to the needs without it being used for political ends. I would like to welcome the efforts made by the United Nations on all of the humanitarian and medical workers in Venezuela, as well as other partners such as the European Union, as was just mentioned by my colleague from France. Secondly, in the absence of a political solution, the humanitarian situation will continue to worsen. And Belgium reiterates its appeal to swiftly launch a peaceful political process, opening the way to free and transparent presidential elections, leading to the reconciliation in Venezuela. As I was already said on several occasions, the presidential elections in May were neither free nor fair nor credible, and they therefore deprived the government of Nicolas Maduro from its democratic legitimacy. We support Juan Guaido in his mission to organize free, fair, and democratic presidential elections. The European Union, together with the countries of the region, have created a contact group which aims in particular to put together the conditions necessary to organize such presidential elections in the near future. And I call upon all of the actors to become fully involved in this initiative. In this context, Belgium is concerned by the information we received, which tells us that there's a growing foreign military assistance to the Maduro regime, the goal of which is far from clear. We plead for a peaceful solution to the situation in Venezuela, and as I said, the presence of foreign security forces does not contribute towards the attainment to this objective, quite the contrary. My third point, Mr. President, is a call to protect the citizens of Venezuela from all forms of violence. The people of Venezuela have the right to express themselves without fear of political prosecution. Intimidation of the press and the representative of the civil society is unacceptable. We urgently call for full respect for the prerogatives provided for in the Constitution and the immunity of all members of the National Assembly, including its president. Their civil rights, their freedom, their physical integrity have to be respected at all times. They have to be in a position to be able to carry out their tasks without any intimidation. And I would like to conclude, lastly, by thanking the countries of the region for the support they have given to the refugees and migrants from Venezuela, in particular Colombia, represented here by the Minister. I thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Ambassador of Belgium.
Word to the Ambassador of Equatorial Guinea, Antonio.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. As our first order of business, we would like to thank all of our briefers this morning at this meeting of the Security Council. The Republic of Equatorial Guinea has been following very closely the evolution of the situation and the roiling tensions in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We deplore the fact that the situation is deteriorating by the day, and we would like to voice our concern that if we continue on the current track, we will end up in a situation that is both unsustainable and undesirable, both for the people of Venezuela but also for the international community. I would like to make it clear that Equatorial Guinea condemns all acts that might sully or undermine respect for human rights. We believe firmly in the freedom of speech and also that any peaceful demonstration should be respected and allowed to go ahead, as long as, of course, said demonstration is in line with the given laws in the country in which it takes place. President, I would like to reiterate publicly my country's commitment to the Charter of the United Nations and to international law, which clearly and categorically forbid the use of force and instead promote respect for territorial integrity and for the sovereignty of all member states of the United Nations. We share the concern expressed by the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Refugees, to wit that the humanitarian situation in Venezuela is going from bad to worse. Whilst we welcome the timely and impressive display of solidarity shown by countries in the region and the compassionate and noble work of humanitarian organizations that are supporting the dozen countries in the region that are hosting millions of Venezuelans, it is nonetheless crucial that these generous nations continue to keep their borders open and work to reduce the conditions and restrictions imposed upon entry to the country. President, we would like here to pay tribute to the efforts that are being made by Cuba to support many countries, not just in its region, but in other regions of the world, in particular Africa, including my own country, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, in the areas of health, education, etc., a clear demonstration by Cuba of the principles of humanitarian solidarity. President, we are faced with an undeniable crisis of refugees and migrants. 3.5 million Venezuelans have poured out of their country. Given that reality, there needs to be greater mobilization in response on the basis of the Global Compact on Refugees in order to guarantee full support for those who are leaving Venezuela, but also for those countries that are taking them in. We therefore call for all those involved to cooperate and come together to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance, as long as said humanitarian assistance complies with the relevant norms and standards on humanitarian aid, but to cooperate to ensure that said humanitarian aid reaches all those in need without discrimination or distinction. We remain convinced that given that this is a national problem, a national crisis of Venezuela, dialogue and negotiations between national political actors and stakeholders is the best way of ending this crisis. By the same token, it would be fortuitous if the parties involved would sit down together around the same negotiating table, in which international bodies, in particular the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations, could serve as impartial and unbiased mediators. We very much welcome the creation of the Montevideo mechanism, the goal of which is to preserve peace in Venezuela on the basis of the principles of non-interference and the peaceful resolution of this conflict. President, we believe that given this tense and turbulent situation, all parties, whether they be directly or indirectly involved, refrain from making statements or engaging in actions that might be interpreted as a threat to use force. This is a way of avoiding riling tensions further, which would only lead to a fresh outbreak of violence, bringing in its wake yet greater suffering and pain. Finally, I would like to reiterate that the crisis in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela should spur all of those involved, both national and international stakeholders, to prioritize the interests of the Venezuelan people over any other personal or factional interest. We therefore urge all political stakeholders to ramp up their efforts to facilitate a peaceful negotiation and to accede to both the good offices of the Secretary General as a way of finding a peaceful solution to the dispute, as well as calling upon them to accede to the involvement of the organs and agencies of the United Nations and of regional and sub-regional organizations to help bring about an effective and long-term agreement that will contribute to strengthening the political, economic and social fabric of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Thank you very much.
I thank the Ambassador of Equatorial Guinea for his intervention, and I give the floor to the Ambassador of Kuwait, Mansour.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for participating in today's meeting, and I would also like to thank the Vice President of the United States of America, Mr. Mike Pence. And I would like to thank all briefers for their briefings. Mr. President, we are confronted with a warring humanitarian crisis whose implications may go beyond Venezuela and neighboring countries if not addressed urgently. There is no doubt that such a situation will have negative repercussions on regional stability and security, and it will then be difficult to contain its security, political, and economic implications. We are concerned at the humanitarian situation. The people of Venezuela are struggling with a severe shortage in food, medicine, water, and electricity, all of which are major life necessities, which reflect a grave economic situation and an unprecedented inflation. All of these factors have led to great movement and displacement over the past years, the majority of which are children and women. Such displacement has placed great pressure, economic and political pressures, on neighboring countries and on their ability to provide refuge and food to these displaced people. 3.5 million Venezuelans have left to more than 15 neighboring countries. 7 million Venezuelans are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, according to OCHA reports, and as we heard from Mr. Lowcock in his briefing. Therefore, we urge the Venezuelan government to open the border crossings to allow humanitarian assistance, including food and medicine, and allowing access to the largest number of people in need, in line with international standards. Mr. President, we call once again on all Venezuelan parties to refrain from any inflammatory measures, provocative measures, and to prioritize the national interest of Venezuela in order to preserve its security, stability, and unity, and in line with the aspirations of the Venezuelan people. We call on them to launch a comprehensive and inclusive dialogue to stem the bloodshed and to preserve the dignity of the Venezuelan people, to address the root causes of the crisis, and to spare Venezuela and the countries of the region further violence and instability. We commend all countries that are seeking a peaceful solution to the crisis. In closing, the State of Kuwait expresses its commitment to the principles of the Charter, including respect for countries and non-interference in their internal affairs, according to the Article 2 of the Charter. Thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Kuwait, Mansour, for the declaration. I now give the floor to South Africa, Jerry.
Mr. President, my delegation wished to recognize the presence of the Secretary General, CDC, António Guterres, and earlier on, Mr. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States of America. We would like to thank all the briefers, especially you, Mr. Lowcock, and your excellent staff in Venezuela. Please pass our utmost gratitude and appreciation for the sterling job they are doing in Venezuela as they discharged and offer much needed assistance to people of Venezuela in the midst of uncertainty and political contestation. Mr. President, international solidarity is a hallmark of most of us in developing countries, including Cuba. The situation in Venezuela requires a constructive and united Security Council in addressing both humanitarian and political situation facing the country. The political situation in Venezuela and continued economic difficulties in that country is a result of myriad of factors, including conflicting geopolitical dynamics. This necessitates the Council's focus on resulting humanitarian situation in Venezuela and its adverse impact on ordinary people. In this regard, I wish to articulate South Africa's position on 3 issues. Firstly, the provision of humanitarian assistance must be provided in accordance with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and in full compliance with the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1446/182. These principles have enabled the Council to act in other difficult situations in order to support the people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. This should be the central approach of this Council on this matter. And that's why we totally agree with the UN Secretary General in the respect. The Council should not politicize the humanitarian assistance in Venezuela. Secondly, it is important that the effective and unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance takes place in coordination and cooperation with the Venezuelan government, acknowledging the fundamental principles of state sovereignty as reflected in the UN Charter. It is therefore necessary to acknowledge and work with established structures in Venezuela so as not to create parallel structures that may also cause increased tension in that country. Third and finally, Mr. President, the provision of humanitarian assistance should be based on an adequate and accurate needs, as Mr. Lowcock was saying, of the situation in order to match these needs with appropriate support and steer away totally from the possibility of humanitarian intervention being used as a pretext for increased tension, including possibility of military intervention. Mr. President, South Africa, therefore, urges all parties to respect the need for impartiality, neutrality, and independence in the provision of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. We also call on the international community to support the channeling of humanitarian assistance through the UN agencies. And we are very grateful, Mr. Lowcock, to say you have increased the capacity of personnel to over 400. We hope we can see more in Venezuela and more such UN presence in the neighboring countries. But also, we should do so through other recognized international organizations, such as the ICRC, in order to promote the much-needed neutrality and impartiality for provision of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. I thank you. I know I'm going to speak on time. Thank you very much.
Jerry, no comment. I give the floor to the Ambassador of Indonesia. Johnny, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, permit me to, like others, thank the briefer of today. I will focus my intervention to address 3 points related to the humanitarian situation. I think that is supposed to be our main focus of today. First is the deteriorating humanitarian situation. which we have been following closely. We are deeply concerned of it. We heard the briefings that the people of Venezuela is experiencing many difficulties. This cannot and must not be ignored. The fact also shows that there are millions of refugees crossing the border, affecting neighboring countries, which should also be addressed. We thank those countries that have received the refugees. We fully support United Nations efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to alleviate the hardship experienced by the people of Venezuela, and of course support the work of the UN OCHA thus far. I have taken note of the 3 areas that deem the Council attention as duly presented by USG Mark Lowcock. Thank you very much, Mark, for that. Mr. President, I believe many countries in this room care about the plight of the Venezuelan people and have the best of intention. But the best of intention is not enough. And therefore, if they have the best of intention, it should not matter how assistance is being delivered, and thus should be channeled their assistance to the UN system, which is impartial and gain the trust of the Venezuelan people. What is most important is that assistance reach those that are really in need, which is the people of Venezuela. This is the time for the United Nations to once again play the crucial role of not only good officers, but also a good guardian of humanity by coordinating the delivery of international assistance. The United Nations have the mandate and expertise, as stated in its charter, I quote, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian characters, unquote. We urge that any delivery of assistance by any parties is guided by the General Assembly Resolution of 46/182 and the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Many has alluded to these points. Such assistance must be free from political objective, and it should be delivered on the basis of need, in close coordination with the Venezuelan government, and in full respect of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Certainly, it is also necessary to create conditions that will enable the successful provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need. We appreciate the granting of full access to humanitarian personnel in Venezuela. Humanitarian assistance should also be provided to refugees in neighboring countries. That brings me to my second point, which is the need for dialogue. Indonesia reiterates that dialogue is the key that will significantly enable best conditions for the smooth flow of humanitarian aid. Indeed, to resolve the broader situation in Venezuela, we would once again urge all parties to prioritize dialogue and accept the Secretary General good offices to help resolve the crisis. In this regard, we encourage countries that have an influence on the parties to also play a positive role. Indonesia has always believed that there has to be a negotiated solution based on dialogue among all those involved, including the option set forth in Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. Third, the Security Council as a whole must do everything it can to not impede but open up avenues that result in constructively and peacefully resolving the ongoing situation. The Security Council has met 3 times to discuss the situation in Venezuela. Yet, it has so far failed to make any differences for the country. Once again, another sad day for the Council. Based on the principle of the UN Charter, the Council must discharge its responsibility by assisting Venezuela to stabilize itself back to normalcy. It should work in unity. The humanitarian challenge that resulted from economic and political difficulties cannot be met unless the Council resolves to rise above its differences. Borrowing the Indonesian national motto, I quote, unity in diversity. Although the Council might be diverse in its view, it should be, or I should say, must be united in its action for the greater good of humanity. Let us show to the people of Venezuela that the Security Council can and will be united. Let us show that we care, that we will not leave them in despair and hopelessness. Mr. President, I am reminded of what Dag Hammarskjöld said. I quote, "The United Nations wasn't created to take mankind into paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell." I quote. Indonesia implores the Security Council to act with unity and determination to be on the right side of history, the side of peace for Venezuela. And I would like to echo the call of ESG Mark Lowcock once again for us to separate humanitarian with political objective. Now is not the time for naming and shaming. Focus on saving life, focus on the many niñas and niños, children of Venezuela, so they have a better future. I must say, after my last statement in this council, I got a call from an ordinary people in Caracas, not only in thanking us for the statement, but also reminding us all here in the council to put aside our differences and think about all the peoples of Venezuela. We have opened the curtain in the Security Council, so let us open our heart and bring light to Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Ambassador of Indonesia for his statement. I give the floor now to Poland, Mariusz.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank the briefers for the very valuable and informative contributions to today's discussion. Our briefers' interventions have clearly demonstrated to all of us the gravity of a humanitarian situation that needs to be addressed in an urgent way to help the people of Venezuela. So there is no doubt that the people of Venezuela are facing the dire humanitarian crisis. And this is a man-made crisis. The crisis resulted from corruption and mismanagement. Furthermore, the crisis and suffering of the people of Venezuela are only further deteriorated by the refusal by the de facto regime of Nicolas Maduro to grant access to the country of a so desperately needed humanitarian aid. The reality on the ground speaks for itself. Health sector is in absolute collapse. The shortages of food and medicine are regular, not sporadic. Widespread malnutrition of children, increasing infant and maternal mortality, researches on infectious disease for long considered eradicated, should not happen in a country that has all the necessary natural and human resources to flourish and should lead statistically in every socioeconomic category. And what makes the case worse? The government is not only unable to resolve these issues, but it also contributes to deepening the crisis by denying the scale of the crisis and casting aside aid offers. And let me thank also Kathleen Page for Johns Hopkins report, and we find these findings very, very troubling. Mr. President, the current humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has particular alarming effect on women and girls, the most vulnerable groups, as in case in the most of conflicts and crises. Trafficking of women for sex and forced labor is increasing throughout the region. Moreover, women in Venezuela are facing further challenges and risks, including a rise in sexual and gender-based violence, shortages of feminine items, and high levels of maternal mortality. Much remains to be done to address the extremely urgent needs, and Venezuelan actors across the political spectrum have a responsibility to put the interests of Venezuelan people at the center of the actions at this critical time. But it is up to the de facto regime to acknowledge the problem first and allow large-scale humanitarian assistance into Venezuela. As we speak, more and more people, 5,000 every day, are crossing the borders, joining more than 3 million Venezuelans that have already fled the country and leaving behind those unwilling or unable to leave despite being forced to live in extremely miserable conditions. The Council cannot remain idle in face of such crisis, which has an adverse effect on the peace and security in the region. We appreciate the efforts of the Latin American countries in order to provide assistance and maintain an open door and to provide assistance to refugees. A friend in need is a friend indeed, and we really commend both the government but also the people of Peru, the people of Colombia represented today by the foreign minister, and Ecuador, and all neighboring countries for the real hospitality for the people of Venezuela. Mr. President, while trying to focus on the humanitarian aspect of this briefing, we cannot refer to the political background of the Venezuelan crisis, and in this regard, two key issues to be addressed are the rule of law and legitimacy. Given the multifaceted challenges ahead and current lack of political dialogue, Poland considers the National Assembly as the only power in Venezuela that represents a democratic mandate obtained in a free, fair, and credible elections. The National Assembly and its president, Juan Guaido, should be heard and should be respected. Once again, we repeat the call for the full respect of his constitutionally mandated prerogatives and immunity of all members of the National Assembly, including of its president. We further appeal for respect for democracy, rule of law, and fundamental freedoms and human rights, including the freedom of assembly, and we call to refrain from violence. Mr. President, the main challenge in the political track of this crisis is to guarantee with all international support the peaceful character of the transition process. We are convinced that the solution to the multidimensional crisis affecting Venezuela can only be a political, democratic, and peaceful one, and the restoration of democracy is possible through free, transparent, and credible presidential elections. We support both the EU initiatives and the Lima Group efforts to find the way out of this acute crisis, which is above all political, with severe economic and humanitarian consequences to the people of Venezuela. And we need to do our utmost to alleviate the most urgent humanitarian needs and to reduce human suffering. We have to support Venezuelans in their hopes for decent life in a democratic and prosperous country. The time is pressing and we can't stay indifferent. And finally, Mr. President, we urge Venezuelan de facto regime to respect and fully protect freedom of media, including safety and security of journalists. We strongly condemn cases of violent attacks and intimidation against both foreign and domestic journalists. All such cases should be investigated in a thorough and independent manner. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for his intervention, and je donne la parole.
I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to also welcome the participation in this meeting of ours of the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Vice President of the United States. We also thank the speakers who took the floor, thank them for their briefings on the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. Mr. President, Côte d'Ivoire follows with special attention the way the situation in Venezuela is developing, and we note with regret that there is an institutional political impasse throughout the country. This political tension seriously impacts the economic situation, which is already difficult, and also further compounds the humanitarian crisis, which is characterized by deteriorating health and food situations, and the consequences of that in the sub-region are tangible. All in all, according to humanitarian agencies, 7 million Venezuelans, about 1/4 of the population, who need food and health care. 3.4 million of them have sought refuge in neighboring countries. Mr. President, the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela calls upon this council to become greatly involved in considering this in order to provide the response to the needs of the millions of people in need, and to do this in line with the principles of international humanitarian law. In this regard, my delegation is of the view that because of its leadership and its major expertise in humanitarian matters, the United Nations has to play a primary role here in order to mobilize its specialized agencies and to coordinate the assistance extended by the international community. Therefore, it is necessary to establish a close cooperation and a synergy of actions between the authorities in Venezuela, the specialized agencies of the United Nations, and all of the international partners, so as to mobilize the means needed to cover the needs and to ensure that there is a safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to the populations in need. We would like to recall for all the parties that they're under obligation to uphold human rights and international humanitarian law. We welcome the authorization extended to the Red Cross to distribute emergency assistance, and would like to thank the neighboring countries for their solidarity as regards the Venezuelan people. To conclude, Mr. President, I would like to say that we want to reiterate our constant position where we plead for a peaceful solution to this crisis. We therefore urge once again all of the parties to become involved in frank negotiations in order to find the end to this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for Côte d'Ivoire for his intervention, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Germany. First, let me pick up where our colleague from Indonesia ended when he said that this is a sad day for the Council. I don't share that view. I think that the discussion today, which we as the presidency wanted to have concentrated on the humanitarian situation, I'm optimistic that from this meeting we will have a situation where more will be done on the humanitarian front. So, with regard to this, I also would like to ask to thank the three briefers for their very impressive statements. Actually, our Russian colleagues called into question the basis for your findings. Maybe afterwards you can still give a bit of indication on the basis of your findings. And again, on our Russian colleague, he compared the situation with regard to the measles in New York and in Venezuela. There's one big difference. If parents here want to vaccine their kids, they can go into a pharmacy and get the vaccine. If you try to get vaccine in a pharmacy in Caracas, you don't find it. And in this context, I would also like to, again, pick up what one of our colleagues said and our Belgian colleague said with regard to arms. And there I would also like to express the view that what Venezuela needs least in this moment is the supply of military weapons. What they need right now is a supply of humanitarian aid, of medical assistance. So I would also, in the light of what our Indonesian colleague has said, I would like to appeal to our Venezuelan colleague that he recognize the dimension of the humanitarian crisis that his country is facing, that he allows all humanitarian actors to work in his country. They need access and they should be able to assist. And the principles, as our French colleague has reminded us, the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence should govern the humanitarian aid. Again, we are, as others, alarmed about the politicization of the humanitarian issues. This runs counter the humanitarian mandate. Many have also alluded to the massive exodus of Venezuelans from their country. As almost everybody around the table, let me also express my solidarity, Germany's solidarity with the neighbors, and pay respect to what Peru, what Ecuador, what Colombia is doing, and pay tribute also to the foreign minister of Colombia. I'd also like to commend the countries in the region that they try to coordinate their efforts in response to this humanitarian crisis. This is the biggest refugee crisis Latin America has seen in its history. Very briefly on the political solution, we need a peaceful political process. All actors have to show restraint, refrain from the use of force, respect human rights. We are in favor of free, transparent, credible presidential elections organized under the leadership of the interim president, Juan Guaido. The EU is ready to help also through its international contact group. Again, the conclusion of this meeting for me is we must not leave the Venezuelan people alone. Thank you very much. And I now take again my hat as chair, and I give the floor to the Russian Federation has asked for the floor. Dimitri.
Very briefly, Christoph, just to introduce clarity in the issue of vaccinations, I just wanted to say that the government of Venezuela was ready to buy vaccines, but the money was stolen from it, as we said, the money that had been deposited in the British and American banks. So the situation is simple here. First, you create a problem, then you suggest that it be solved. Just to clarify things. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to give the floor to the ambassador from the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, I know you don't want to prolong this, and I don't want to get into a tit for tat, but the money was not stolen from a British bank. It's very important that we correct these falsehoods. Thank you.
I thank the ambassador from United Kingdom for her intervention, and I give the floor now to the ambassador representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente. Thank you, President. To begin, I think it is incumbent upon us to respond to a broad range of lies and false information that we heard from the mouth of the Vice President of the United States here. We're supposed to be here discussing the humanitarian situation, but I think we need to respond to what he said so we can clarify things before the international community, before the people of Venezuela, before the media. He lied in saying that yesterday the region as a whole rejected the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in the Organization of American States. That is false. That is a lie. It is misinformation, a problem that perhaps he needs to address with his legal team. Yesterday, what happened in their thirst to promote a coup d'etat in Venezuela and impose a puppet government to uphold their interests, the U.S. interests in Venezuela, which would allow for the pillaging of our resources, then they ran roughshod over the founding charter of the OAS, which is commensurate with the Charter of the United Nations. And they twisted the law to such an extent that what was approved was not the expulsion of the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the OAS. Rather, they approved and adopted the inclusion of a representative of the National Assembly of Venezuela. And this is absurd. It's a legal fiction, what happened yesterday, because the OAS, just like the United Nations, is an organization of states. It is not an organization bringing together national assemblies. And the only state present representing us in this organization is the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Thus, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was not expelled from the OAS. What we have instead in the OAS is a strange individual. Nobody understands what he's doing there, what he will be doing there, because he doesn't represent the state of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He represents the National Assembly. It's important to understand that. So what was said was a lie. Why do I flag this here? Because this is just part of the machinery of lies which is intended to sell the course of action of the United States to the members of the United Nations. What they're seeking to do is impose a puppet government, and they want to convince the United Nations of the rightness of their actions. They want to see the United Nations as the club of friends, the backyard of the United States. They have to subordinate the United Nations to their interest, to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine being a racist policy that was set up 200 years ago by a slaving state. and which runs roughshod over international law. It has no basis in international law. There's no basis in international law for what the United States is doing. We are sure when the United States attempted to pull the wool over the eyes of the attempts here in the United Nations to play the same trick as it played in the Organization of American States, pulling the wool over the eyes of those present, it will fail here. We certainly hope it will fail here. It has threatened with war. It has threatened us with war as well. All options are on the table. On what legal basis are all options on the table? On what legal basis can one country threaten another with war here around this room? This is something else that the United Nations should address. Now turning to the topic that brings us together here, President. The humanitarian situation in Venezuela does need to be resolved. But if we err in the diagnosis, then we will also be mistaken in the treatment that we give that's intended to bring succor to Venezuela. The situation, as has been said here, is the fruit of human action. But what everyone has tiptoed around here in the room, including the three briefers who are very smart, intelligent people, they're able to draw together data, analyze that data, including Mr. Stein, who's a very wise man, but they shut their eyes to what the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela wants to share with them. But they will hear, for example, the dictator government in Guatemala. That has been done by Mr. Stein and his team, but yet they refuse to meet with us to hear what we have to say. But as I was saying, none of the three briefers and none of the members of the Security Council acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that the actions that have led to the humanitarian suffering that we're seeing in Venezuela are the direct fruit of a plan of economic destruction put together by the government of the United States and the United Kingdom with the goal of strangling our national economy, thus triggering the maximum degree of social suffering, eroding the capacity of our nation for self-sufficiency and to respond to said suffering. And when all is said and done, the intention here is to provoke a social implosion that they can then use as a pretext for foreign military intervention, hiding behind the perverse notion of the responsibility to protect that has been the pretext wielded for colonial invasions of those countries that have oil reserves. This is a mind-boggling, inhumane experiment in unconventional warfare. It's a policy of calculated cruelty, violating en masse human rights, going so far, I would say, as to being equivalent to committing crimes against humanity. And all of this is done with the goal of justifying the pillaging and looting, to justify the imposing of a subordinate and puppet local government, and in our particular case, hiding behind a racist ideology, the Monroe Doctrine. People might think that we're exaggerating, but you only need to hear the words themselves of these criminals. This is not what I had to say. This is what has been said by these criminals by the United States. On the 9th of January 2018, spokespersons of the Department of State affirmed that the campaign of pressure targeting Venezuela is working. And what we are seeing is a complete economic collapse in Venezuela. In other words, our policy is working, our strategy is working, and we will stay the course with this policy and with this strategy, end of quote. In October of last year, Ambassador William Brownfield of the United States said, and here I quote directly, "We need to treat this as a suffering, tragedy, agony that will continue until it reaches its endpoint. And if we can do anything to speed up this process of tragedy and agony, then we should do it, understanding that this will have an impact on millions of people who are already having difficulties daily in finding food and medicine. We cannot pursue this course of action and pretend that it will have no impact whatsoever. We have to take a hard and harsh decision. The end justifies the means of this severe punishment." These are not diplomatic words. These are not the words of a humanitarian agent. This is inhumane. This is cruel. These are the words justifying an international crime, a determination and a willingness to punish the entire Venezuelan people. Senator Marco Rubio, who supported the coup d'etat in Venezuela, stated that over the next few weeks, Venezuela will go through a period of suffering that no other country in the Western Hemisphere has ever suffered in modern history. And on the 22nd of March 2019, John Bolton, of infamous memory and ignominy in this organization, said that this is like Star Wars. This is similar to when Darth Vader strangled someone, snuffed their life out. This is what we're doing economically to Venezuela. I'm not inventing any of this. You can go back and check. These are their words. This is deliberate economic destruction. It's the systematic application of the policy of aggression with the use of financial instruments wielded against us and undue pressure. They have used their dominant position in the markets to influence the banking sector, private businesses, and other nations that engage in legal business and exchange and trade with Venezuela, including agencies of the United Nations who have also suffered extortion wielded by the United States. And all of this is to isolate our country from the trade systems and international financial systems of this planet. If it was true that the Venezuelan government, as has been affirmed here so many times as part of a litany of lies, if it was true that the Venezuelan government, as has been claimed erroneously, is killing its own people, then why is this group of countries doing all it can on such a mass scale to increase the suffering? Why would there be the need if we're already responsible for the suffering of our people? This gives the truth to the lie. It is them who are responsible for the suffering of our people. It is them who are seeking social breakdown to justify their invasion. It is a plan in which banks, insurance companies, and indeed the tools of trade such as boats and shipping systems are used with a destructive capacity comparable to weapons of mass destruction, but without those responsible for this suffering being taken before the courts to suffer the moral sanction that they deserve. John Bolton said in January of this year, "My advice to bankers, businessmen, and other traders is not to trade in gold, oil, or other Venezuelan products." Whilst on the 29th of March 2019, Elliot Abraham said, "We're imposing our sanctions." This is what he said directly. "We, the United States, are imposing our sanctions." And what is the regime doing in response? The regime is trying to find ways to sidestep said sanctions, to seek out new clients, to seek new markets for imports. So what do we do in response? We observe very closely, and we can see boats on the ocean moving, and we can see contracts being signed with new companies. And the minute we detect such action, we speak with the shipping companies, with the transport companies, with the refineries, with the governments, and we tell them you should not be doing this. This is what we are doing. That's what Mr. Abrahams was saying. He who is depicted here as an angel, an agent of humanity and humanitarian action. This reprehensible act is a criminal policy of mass destruction, and it goes hand in hand with the looting and pillaging that has cost our nation so many millions of dollars. At the same time as they're depriving our people of essential goods, leading to huge levels of suffering, they are with the left hand robbing our Venezuelan people of thousands of millions, if not billions of dollars. The profits of our refineries are being used to pay the debts of oil companies that are friendly to the government of Trump. His friends hold Venezuelan debt, and they're receiving special licenses to pursue profits with money stolen from our people. That's what they're lining their pockets with. That's what they're profiteering from. They have announced a plan to lead into debt my country, which has led to a debt of $70 billion. And this money is used to pay uncertified debts that are allegedly the fruit of shadowy financial negotiation, but nobody can prove the amount of these debts which this money is allegedly being used to pay off. We cannot forget the fact that the Bank of England, which robbed our people of $1.2 billion in gold with the excuse that they did not recognize the president of Nicolas Maduro, and they will continue the sanctions of Trump. And then we hear the representative of the United Kingdom talking about the fact that they took this step to avoid money laundering, which is just ridiculous. That gold has been in the Bank of England for 30 years now, with nobody raising concerns about money laundering whatsoever. They are working together with the puppet government and saying that they are complying with the sanctions of the United States and with the order of the British government to recognise the puppet government. The credibility of the Bank of England as a neutral and impartial organisation has been ruined. Their reputation is as naught. All they're doing is supporting the government of Trump. The colonialist policies of Trump are building on their own colonialist history and their own history of piracy, which they have pursued for at least the last 200 years. This is the real cause of the plight of Venezuelan people. There is no other reason for it. Our people are suffering, and our government too, as can be testified to by the Secretary General, who is working closely and hard with the United Nations system to boost the number of cooperation projects as well as the volume and capacity of these programs, particularly in the healthcare sector as well as the sectors of food, education, electricity and transport. There can be no doubt, President, if you were better informed in Venezuela, you would know that vaccines are available in Venezuela, and our coverage of vaccinations for malaria and measles, for example, and to be able to stamp out these diseases has improved markedly thanks to our partnership with organizations such as the World Health Organization. People are being deceived. Their vaccines are available in Venezuela, and our healthcare coverage, including the delivery of vaccines, has improved remarkably over the last few years. All of that is measurable. The same is happening with our cooperation with the ICRC, the president of whom met yesterday in Caracas with our head of state, Nicolas Maduro, to make progress in the founding of a direct mechanism that would facilitate genuinely neutral, impartial and independent assistance. And the same can be said of friendly countries who stand ready to provide assistance on a peaceful basis and fully respecting our sovereignty in so doing. One key factor that has been underestimated by those who are waging war against Venezuela is the sheer strength of our national spirit, which only increases when we are faced with difficulties. This macabre experiment in destruction and bringing to its knees a nations is seeking to prove that economic crimes do work for these nefarious ends, that people will eventually break and that they will cede to the oppressive foreign power. Nonetheless, in Venezuela, they have miscalculated. The collective suffering caused is resisted by growing levels of organization and determination in our people. Our Bolivarian national armed forces have not broken and are more united than ever. Our workers are reacting to the attacks on our infrastructure with a discipline that the aggressors are unfamiliar with and cannot boast of for themselves. There are problems that we have to deal with, but they are not there are problems, there are some instances of aggression and violence, but they are not aimed at civil war, and this will not be the end game for all that those who are bringing this pressure to bear on us would like it to be the case. Our people is setting an example to the world of how to resist in peace. It might be logical to think that the efforts of our government to overcome the difficulties caused by this aggression would in fact be recognized, applauded and supported by the international community, who claim to be so interested in alleviating suffering. Rather, what we're seeing is a fresh wave of economic extortion, which is cutting off financial flows to our country and from our country to abroad, and is also affecting our cooperation with the very agencies of the United Nations, who, as I speak, are unable to find a way to receive funding and money and to send the necessary goods and supplies to meet the needs of our people. And do you know why that is the case? It is because the government of Trump is engaged in a campaign of terror against commercial and financial agents who have anything to do with Venezuelan money. We are not asking for handouts or for anybody's money. We have our own money, but the government of Trump terrorizes economic actors, traders and international agencies so that they won't actually touch the money that we're willing to offer to pay for the services they can provide. What the United States is interested in, and has been interested in thus far, is not humanitarian aid, but rather a covert operation without the consent of Venezuela, violating our territorial integrity with a constant threat of the use of force, as we heard again today, and openly inciting a military uprising and civil war. That's the speciality of this government of Mr. Abrahams. President, this Security Council bears the responsibility, according to Articles 24, 34 and 39 of the Charter, a responsibility to maintain and uphold international peace and security, and to identify the existence of threats to peace, and also to identify and respond to acts of aggression. And thus we would solicit, we would demand, that we request that you identify and determine the following. Firstly, what is the legal basis allowing the United States and the United Kingdom to apply to Venezuela a program of economic destruction without the express consent of this Security Council? They're enacting measures covered in Article 41 of the Charter, including an economic blockade, without the authorization and consent of the Security Council. When the Security Council reached that finding of reached that finding that these two nations, the United States and the United Kingdom, are acting without the consent of the Security Council and without the covering of the Charter. My second question to you, what legal authority does the United States have to sanction to imply secondary sanctions to countries that trade legally with Venezuela? Thirdly, the Security Council needs to determine what is the legal basis allowing the United States to threaten Venezuela with the use of military force. Where is this legal basis to be found? Why has there been no statement made in response to what is clearly being done by the United States, such clear threats? Fourth, I would ask the Security Council to determine what is the legal authority allowing the United States and the United Kingdom to appropriate our wealth. We're supposed to thank them for their offer of $9 million to address the humanitarian situation in Venezuela when the Bank of England stole $1.2 billion of our money. The Bank of England is supposed to be an independent organisation. We hear from the Bank of England themselves that we are obeying the government of the United Kingdom, despite their alleged independent status. As I was saying, my fourth question to you, that you as the Security Council need to determine what is the legal authority used by the United States and the United Kingdom to appropriate our wealth, obtaining profit therefrom with a mass violation of the human rights of our people. Fifth, what is the legal basis allowing the United States to intervene in affairs that are strictly the preserve of the internal preserve of the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan government in a flagrant violation of Article 2.7 of the Charter. To conclude, the diagnosis of the current situation, President, is that it is clearly and blatantly the result of a campaign of aggression meted out by the United States and the United Kingdom. The treatment for this suffering cannot be a fresh dose of aggressive intervention hiding behind a humanitarian facade. The solution is not in donations from criminals who want to present themselves or set themselves up as saviors. The treatment for Venezuela is not in humanitarian channels designed to provoke and trigger armed conflict, or in donor conferences that hide what's actually going on, the looting and pillaging of the resources of our nation. The treatment, rather, lies in returning the money which has been stolen to Venezuela, in lifting the commercial and financial blockade on our people, in ceasing the sabotage of our infrastructure in clandestine operations, in ceasing the threats of military intervention, and in ceasing to threaten those Venezuelans who want to engage in dialogue. We must stop this war of Donald Trump, and this Security Council must live up to its responsibility and live up to its mandate, guaranteeing that Venezuela can enjoy its right to peace. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic for his statement. The representative of the United Kingdom has asked for the floor to make a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I apologise for taking the floor again, but I can't allow those allegations against the Bank of England to go unaddressed. I reject completely the allegations made by the Venezuela ambassador. He's made them before. I wrote to the then president of the Security Council, the Equatorial Guinea PR, on the 21st of February, rejecting the allegations. I will have that letter circulated again, and we'll put it on our website. But for the benefit of the record, Bank of England's reputation is world-renowned. It operates to the highest standards. It has operational independence from the British government. Thank you.
I thank the representative of UK for her statement, and the representative of Peru has asked for the floor to make a further statement. Gustavo.
Thank you very much, President. I promise I'll be succinct. I do not think it is worth responding to someone who does not represent a country duly. It is beneath our dignity to respond to the representative of an illegitimate government. I think what we want to underscore is a point that has been referred to by many people, and that is the plight of Venezuelan refugees and migrants, which was not dealt with in the statement we just heard, and which is very important and very serious. Many countries in the region are making Herculean efforts. Peru is home to some 750,000 migrants who we're supporting with our own resources. A little more than a month ago, I flagged this point to the representative of Mr. Maduro, and he wasn't able to respond to me. And so I'd like to ask him today, why didn't he refer to the serious plight of the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans that they're suffering today? Today we heard, to our great surprise, the frivolous way in which the representative of Mr. Maduro said that the situation in Venezuela was normal. This reflects what we heard about a month ago when we addressed this in the Security Council again. We were told that everyone was happy, everyone was preparing for carnival, etc. Today what we heard additionally is that the situation is the result of sanctions and outside action. As I said in my statement, the serious humanitarian economic crisis that we're seeing in Venezuela is the direct result of domestic action. For years in Peru and in other nations, we have been seeing growing flows, growing outpourings from Venezuela of people. That's been the case for years. So we cannot accept this theory, which is intended to deceive world public opinion as to the roots of a crisis. The roots of this crisis are to be found in Venezuela itself. They are not the result of foreign meddling. Thank you very much, President.
Thank the representative of Peru for his statement. The representative of Venezuela has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, President. First and foremost, on the Bank of England, we will circulate to all the members of the United Nations and to the public at large the truth on this situation. The Bank of England is not independent. And letters of correspondence confirm that. Letters sent to our representatives in which they say black on white that they are following the sanctions applied by the government of the United States. This proves that the Bank of England is not independent. Also proof of its lack of independence is its willingness to communicate with opponents of the government of Venezuela imposed by the United States. It engages in communication with those representatives. The Bank of England has no prestige. Given what it's doing with us, it also did with Libya in the past. The Bank of England simply seizes any opportunity available to it when a country is weak, and it swings in the wind. The most recent example is that the government of the United Kingdom states that their traditional policy is to recognize states and not governments, and that this will not change. In the case of Venezuela, they did change that policy, and now they say they don't recognize our state, but they recognize a puppet government, which doesn't control even a single street in Venezuela, and the Bank of England has swung into line behind this policy. And the president of the Central Bank of Venezuela, whom they've dealt with for years, they now say that they don't recognize him because the government of the United Kingdom has changed its opinion. This is not an independent bank. We need to tread carefully if you believe that that is the case, because you're entering into dangerous waters. In response to the ambassador of Peru, I think it's worth recalling to him that the United Nations is not the book club of the United States under Peru, and that Peru's individual decision to recognize a nation or not, to recognize a government or not, has no impact on my status here in the United Nations. My legitimacy depends on the legitimacy of my government as recognized by the United Nations. It is not dependent on declarations by the ambassador of Peru or the vice president of the United States. To feel that you have the power in your hands to expel from the United Nations your friends, your enemies rather, those that you don't like, simply indicates to me that you don't understand the Charter of the United Nations and the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So I sound a warning bell once again that there is a clear move here again to undermine our rights. And if they can undermine our rights, they can undermine the rights of all members of this organization. So we must tread carefully and reject this. On migrants and refugees, we cannot deny that this is happening in Venezuela. But the root cause of this is economic. But I do think it's ridiculous that we use the word refugees. Because when you talk about refugees, you usually mean somebody who is suffering from political pressure or political persecution, has to flee a country for that reason and is unable to come back. That is not the case with Venezuela. People leave Venezuela and people come back to Venezuela freely, and this happens day after day. There are instances of people going abroad for a number up to 30,000 to work abroad, but they come back the same evening. So they're not refugees, they're simply working abroad. The ambassador of Peru is suggesting that we treat as a security problem economic refugees or economic migrants. If that is the case, then he has to explain the situation of what is happening with the economic refugees on the border of the United States that are being treated as a humanitarian crisis, a security crisis by the government of President Donald Trump, by building a wall, by sending the army to the border with Mexico. This should have been addressed by the ambassador of Peru if he really felt that migrants and refugees should be treated with the dignity that he claims that they should be. But this is not being said by the ambassador of Peru, which I think is further proof that Venezuela is being treated as a unique case and the ground is being laid for an invasion. That is why I come back to my own statement, call upon you to exercise your duty of indicating and determining whether there is a legal basis for the action being taken against Venezuela and Venezuela alone. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of Venezuela for his statement. As the briefers have been addressed during the discussions, I would like to give him an opportunity to take the floor. And first ask Mark Lowcock if he wants to say something.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. You asked me a question about the basis on which we are assessing humanitarian need in Venezuela. And I'm happy, if the Security Council wishes, to provide a written explanation of how we do this. But in summary, in the interest of time, as I said in my statement, the work we've done so far has been on the basis of all of the available data. We have, in the best way we're able to in Venezuela, applied our tried and tested methodology that we use all over the world to assess humanitarian need. We've applied our standard system for caveating and quality controlling the use of the data and the judgments we make on the data. And again, as I said earlier, we are keen to sustain the consultations we have with the government and with others, because the only basis for principled humanitarian action as the situation evolves is a serious and professional ongoing effort to assess humanitarian need. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Lowcock, for his statement. I give the floor to Mr. Eduardo Stein if he wants to comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will only refer to two things: the legitimacy of the data, which we have carefully picked based on the immigration data of legal crossings in the bordering governmental installation of the migration authorities of the receiving countries. And of course, the hardest hit is the Colombian territory. But if we were to include the varied video recordings of irregular footpaths or blind trails or unofficial border points, which are also daily used by the different numbers of unrecorded Venezuelans crossing irregularly, the numbers would go well above 4 million mark. And as you know, irregularity increases vulnerability, but we have chosen not to include these irregular numbers of blind crossings. Secondly, I just would like, with all due respect, to set the record straight about what was said by the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in the Security Council today. I was officially invited by his administration last year, and on November 16, I personally met with Foreign Minister Arreaza, and I never, ever resisted or gave any indication of not willing to go to Caracas to attend the invitation. The only request I expressed was for an agenda of the visit. In other words, what were they inviting me for, insofar as I must remember to the member states of the Security Council, our mandate is basically humanitarian, to attend those people who have left the Venezuelan territory. But in any case, Foreign Minister Arreaza agreed that they would send a proposed agenda for my visit, which I am still waiting for. Thank you.
Mr. Eduardo Stein for his statement, and I give the floor to Ms. Kathleen Page.
So the question regarding the data, as I mentioned, we did some site visits. We spoke to workers within and outside the Venezuela, and also reviewed publicly published data by the Pan American Health Organization and the WHO. Further details about our methodology is published in the peer-reviewed Lancet article that came out 2 weeks ago, for those who are interested in reviewing this. I also want to highlight that we did obtain official data when we could, and we, just to highlight one point, as I mentioned, the childhood mortality and maternal mortality has increased from 2015 to 2016 pretty significantly. That data comes from official reports from the from the Venezuelan Ministry of Health, and that decline preceded the economic sanctions that have been mentioned. Thank you.
I thank also Ms. Page for her statement. The representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has asked for the floor, and I give you the floor.
I hope this will be the last time I have to weigh in, President. Thank you very much for giving me the floor once again. Once again, to make it very clear to Mr. Stein that we have a letter signed by him himself when he says that he cannot come to Venezuela despite our invitation because his mandate does not allow him so to do. And for this reason, we lodged a formal complaint with the Secretary General. We have a document, a letter, that proves that he doesn't want to meet with us. That's why I raised the point in my statement. I did so correctly. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.